It seems like watching the news nowadays is like watching a pet goldfish circle the toilet bowl before it finally goes down the drain. We've been dealing with a pandemic, social unrest, and political strife for over 2 years, and now it looks like we could be teetering on the edge of a global conflict. These events and others are causing disruptions to supply chains and prices of pretty much everything to skyrocket. Because of this, every prepper should do what they can to become less dependent on outside food sources. Today I'll be talking about ways that every prepper can be more food independent, no matter where they may live. When it comes to being food independent, there are several different ways that you can do that. And the first is to continue to just do the good prepper thing of just setting aside food every time that you go to the grocery store. Each time you go, pick up a few extra canned goods, pick up an extra bag of beans or rice, and then set that aside, and of course buy in bulk when you can. Now, I know that it is best to buy, especially in bulk, at times when prices are low, but to be honest with you, I do not see prices going down anytime soon, so it's always a good idea to pick up those types of items whenever they are available and continue to do so until they are not. So pick up things like canned goods, dried beans and rice, and dried pasta. And then also freeze-dried foods are great. You're probably not going to be able to store as many of those types of food items just because they are significantly more expensive. But it's still a good idea to pick some up, especially for things like your bug out bag. And anytime that you're going to buy those in bulk, as with any food, try to buy small portions to test out to make sure that what you're buying is something that you can actually stomach eating for the long term. Another way that you can be more food independent is to do things like hunting, fishing, and trapping. And I know a lot of y'all watching the channel, y'all probably already do at least one of those activities, probably more already. But now might be a good time to expand your capabilities in those areas. For example, if you're primarily a deer hunter, maybe branch out into hunting other animals as well, particularly small animals like squirrels, because if there is some sort of long-term grid down situation, there's a good chance that the larger animals are going to get pretty much wiped out, and the smaller ones might be there for a little bit longer. And also, if you're a hunter but you haven't done much fishing, maybe get some practice doing that, get the equipment, and then also the same goes for trapping. I think that there's a lot of hunters, there's a lot of fishers watching the channel, and while there may be some, there's probably significantly fewer people that have experience trapping out there. So learn how to do that, get that equipment, and it's also an excellent idea to learn how to preserve any meat that you harvest out in the field without the use of like electronic refrigeration or anything like that. Learn those old school skills that'll allow you to preserve the meat that you harvest for a longer period of time. There is, however, one more thing that I think every prepper should do to be more food independent, and that is gardening. I think that you should give it a try regardless of if you're on a 100-acre homestead, which would be a great ideal situation, or even if maybe you're in a one-bedroom apartment that has a porch. I think no matter what situation that you're in, even if you don't have enough room to grow all the vegetables and fruits that you'll need, you can at least start getting the skills that could be useful later on and have a little bit extra food in the meantime. And this time of year is an absolutely perfect time to get started with that. And one reason why now is such a great time to get started is everything's in season. Companies are starting to send out their first batches of items to be purchased, and a lot of people haven't really got started with that. So there are things like tomato cages, for instance, that got sold out in the early summer when I started my garden last year, that they just have stacks of at like Tractor Supply. So there are a lot of things like, soil and like small pieces of equipment that you can get right now easily that might be harder to get later on as people start gardening more, or if there's further disruptions to the supply chain. And this being the time of year that it is, there's a lot of common crops that it is just about either the perfect time to start those, or you're not too terribly far off. Even if you've missed it by maybe a few weeks, you're not completely shot if you go ahead and start now. And there are some things about gardening itself that I think make it really appealing if you're a prepper or into survival. And one of those is you know exactly what you're putting in your body. If you start those plants from seeds and grow them all the way to harvest, you know what seed you use, you know whether or not you use certain types of fertilizers, certain types of pesticides, so that can give you peace of mind. And then also the way that the world is going with the economy and this conflict in Ukraine, there might be a need to bring back things like the freedom gardens. I think that's what they were called, like in World War II. And if that does become necessary, then you are going to already have a leg up. You're already going to have some basic knowledge and skills. You're going to have some plants in the ground. And really the only downside that I can see with gardening itself is that it requires time and it requires effort. And I know in today's busy world, sometimes it can be hard to do those things, but at least for me and my purposes, it's something that I've went ahead and I have bit the bullet and started doing, and I'm by no means an expert on it, but I think it's incredibly important to be able to grow your own food, especially if there is a long-term situation. Now, obviously, when it comes to gardening, if you have a large piece of property that has arable land, then you're going to have a significant advantage over somebody that does not. You're going to be able to do things like have row gardens, build greenhouses, you can even do permaculture, and if you're not familiar with what that is, in a nutshell, just basically every plant in your garden has a purpose that allows it to help support other plants within kind of a self-contained ecosystem. If you ever watch Doomsday Preppers, the episode with Rick and Jane Austen, they have a permaculture garden, and it was just absolutely awesome. And I know Doomsday Preppers, sometimes there's some crazy stuff on there, but there's also some really brilliant stuff on there occasionally, and their garden was one of them. You should do like a YouTube search or go to like, Nat Geo's app on Roku or whatever, and check that episode out, because there is some pretty cool stuff in there. And while, yes, large amounts of property are better, gardening can be done at least in some form pretty much wherever you are, even if you're in a residential area with a small yard or even an apartment. And yes, growing a garden in a small yard, or if you're an apartment dweller, does present significant challenges, and I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and tell you that you're going to be able to grow all the food that you ever need on a 5 by 4 foot apartment patio. I'm not saying that at all, but there are ways that you can do it to have at least a little bit of food. And take me, for example, I live in the city limits, so I started a container garden last year, and that's something that you can do pretty much anywhere as long as you have at least some sunlight. And you're going to be able to grow things like tomatoes, cherry tomatoes, pepper plants, and then maybe even some potatoes as well. Probably the most common type of container that you'll see people using if they are container gardening is going to be just food-safe 5-gallon buckets. That's what I started off with last year, but you do have some other options. This right here is, I believe it's a 10-gallon grow bag. I'm going to be using this to grow potatoes with. It's larger than those 5-gallon buckets, obviously because it's 10 gallons. And it also has this little window right here that you can open up to see if you have taters growing. You don't have to guess what's going on underground. You can just open that up. I haven't used those before. I'm hoping they're a good idea. We'll see. And then they also have larger ones. Like this is a 50-gallon grow bag. And it's not quite as big as what I thought it would be, but something larger like that is going to allow you to plant things like melons. I'm going to be growing kiwanos. If you don't know what those are African horned cucumbers. They look crazy. They look like something off of Star Trek. Again, I think it'll be hilarious because it'll freak my neighbors out. They won't know what I'm growing. And then also, I'm going to put some sunflowers in there too, specifically mammoth sunflowers. I'm hoping that they'll grow before the kiwanos do, and I'll have some nice hefty stalks for them to wrap around and grow upwards. We'll see if that works. I don't know, but it's worth a shot. And another good thing about container gardening that maybe some people don't think about is, especially if you use something like 5-gallon buckets, then your garden is going to be portable. And while you're not going to be able to carry maybe all of your plants with you, you should be able to take at least some if you have to leave your home for whatever reason. Like if you have a favorite pepper plant or you have some potatoes, because those I think give you a lot of bang for your buck, then you can load those up in the back of your car. If you have something like a box trailer, then that's going to be even better. So you can take at least some of your renewable food supply with you when you go. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that I started container gardening last year, and I learned some things that you definitely want to avoid doing, or you definitely want to do that you might not read in all the how to start a container garden blog articles that are out there on the internet. And the first one is do not use too small of a container. I think that for most plants, really a 5-gallon bucket is going to be the minimum that you should use for things like pepper plants or tomato plants, even if they're for small cherry tomatoes. And the reason why is, especially if you live in a hot area like what I do, those small containers, the water is going to dry out of those very quickly, and it's going to be very hard to keep those plants watered the way that you should. And another thing that I learned is that you don't want to wait too long to transplant small plants into their permanent home. It just, I don't know if it necessarily stunts their growth, but I think it slows down the process so that you will end up getting less food in the end. If you have taller plants such as tomatoes, you want to make sure that you place those tomato cages to support those plants early so that when you stick them into the soil, you don't risk damaging the root system. And another thing for tall plants is you want to have some way to prevent those buckets from blowing over. I had a huge problem with that last year, and one thing I'm going to be doing is I am going to be making these kind of stands to keep my buckets in. I'll share those with y'all later, but that will hopefully prevent those buckets from tipping over and causing damage to the plant. Also, make sure that you have a decent watering can. When I first started, I just used a pitcher to water my plants, and the big problem with that is, especially when the plants are small, is if you don't have a good watering can whose spout kind of, spreads out the flow of the water, then you could damage those small plants and kind of almost uproot them. So having a good water can is a must, and also don't start out too small. Like when I first started, I only had a handful of plants, and I kept finding myself adding plants as the season went on, and that was fine, except for if I would have started those plants sooner, I would have had a better harvest. I also learned that, especially if you are a new gardener, then you want to have some hybrid plants as well. Now, of course, you want to have most of your plants that are heirloom varieties where you can collect the seeds and use them in future years. But as a new gardener, you're probably going to make mistakes, and hybrid plants like what you buy at the store, they're going to be a lot more forgiving because they're a lot more hardy. So the worst thing that can happen is you get started out and you wipe out all of your plants and you never do it again. At least with some hybrids, you'll have a few that you can afford to make some mistakes with. And lastly, be sure to plant some herbs and some flowers in your garden to attract pollinating insects. You need those guys around your garden. Last year, I only had things like pepper and tomato plants. I didn't have any flowers. I didn't have anything like rosemary or anything like that. So it was hard to get those pollinating insects where they needed to be. So while your goal is, yes, to grow food, and you might not think flowers that are pretty might be all that useful, they actually are, because those insects come in and they help pollinate your garden so that you can actually get a harvest. Another good option, especially if you live somewhere like a home with a small yard or an apartment, is going to be an Aero Garden, and they have several different sizes. This is one of their smallest ones. It's called the Harvest, and then they have other ones that are big enough to grow like full-size pepper and tomato plants that you can stack. I mean, you could fill your garage with them and have a complete indoor garden. But this is more or less a self-contained, kind of small-scale aquaponics system. And even using something like this, since the lights actually, they go up a little bit higher, you're going to be able to grow things like herbs, like cilantro. You're going to be able to grow different types of lettuce, small cherry tomato plants. But one thing this is very good for, and it's what I'm using it for right now, is seed starting. So you're going to be able to start seeds with something like this much, much faster than you would the traditional way. And yes, this does require electricity to operate, but if you have a larger like solar power system, like an EcoFlow Delta, then that's going to be able to power that. It's not going to really use, I think this is 23 or 25 watts, so you should be able to run this for a few days before having to recharge that device. And y'all, food storage and gardening should be viewed as two things that go together. For instance, if there is a large-scale disaster that starts during a time of year where there's not many of your crops growing, then your food storage can get you through that time. But once your garden starts producing, you're going to be able to eat off of that and preserve your food storage, which will keep you fed for as long as possible. And of course, once you do start gardening, once you do start harvesting larger amounts of food, you're going to need to be able to preserve that. So that's when things like canning comes in. That's another thing that we should all be learning how to do. It's on my to-do list. But if you want to learn about the different levels of prepper food storage, go ahead and click this card here. Thank y'all. Y'all have a good one.